OWGR's sole objective is to rank the best players across the globe. Today's communication makes clear that it can no longer deliver on that objective. A ranking which fails to fairly represent all participants, irrespective of where in the world they play golf, robs fans, players, and all of golf stakeholders of the objective basis underpinning any accurate recognition of the world's best player performances. Professional golf is now without a true or global scoring and ranking system. There is no benefit for fans or players from the lack of trust or clarity as long as the best player performances are not recognized. Jamie, that was, of course, a statement from Live Golf on October 10th, 2023. And before you ask, I am pretty sure that's how they would have preferred it to be read. And the reason I did read it is to show not just the system in flux at the time, but how it had risen to be so important and also so controversial. So this is the 50 Things That Changed Golf. It's our podcast that dives deep into the events and moments that shape the game we all love. And I am here with one of the top-ranked golf journalists, not only in the world, but the entire universe, Jamie Kennedy. Jamie, how are you? And what are we going to talk about today?
I'm doing very well. Shane, you know when you look at a dog and you always sort of project on it what voice it'll have? You just used my dog voice for the intro, so I very much enjoyed that. But we are, of course, going to be talking about the official World Golf Ranking, or OWGR, as me and you like to call it, but we're the only ones. We're going to talk about how it came to be, the man behind it all, the architect of it, and why and how it became controversial.
All right, Jamie, we are men of accountability. So before we get into all of this, I do think we should go to our elephant section. And I think maybe this is the first time we've named what this is. So do you want to explain what's happening here?
Yes, indeed. So there is elephants in the room sometimes. We are recording these long-form podcasts. We do spend a lot of time and a lot of pride on our research, but of course, we are prone to getting a couple of things wrong. I think I apologized to the Powerpuff Girls in the last episode. And so this is a time where we can say sorry for something we did in the last episode, or just raise something that we got wrong. So Shane, surely we got nothing wrong in the 2019 Masters episode.
I think actually, Jamie, I think we were pretty good, but I do want to mention the timing of it. We taped it before Tiger Woods' car crash, and it was released after his car crash. So it was, to all appearances, two people who were ignoring a very big elephant in the room. We didn't hear about it before. But I also think it's interesting that happened to Tiger, and we dreamed up this idea for the OWGR thing where we're going to talk a lot about Live. And as we sit here chatting, Live seems to be maybe potentially on its death door. So there may be a 50 things curse. I don't know. Yeah. I think you and I, would you take payment for people who pay us not to talk about them so something horrible
we're
doesn't
open.
happen?
We're open to it. But yeah, I think sometimes there's a Sports Illustrated bump and there's things that happen where, things get a bump in their career, but we seem to be having the opposite effect. So I apologize to whoever or whatever we pick as a topic for the next episode. But
the other thing I wanted to mention, this is a very minor thing, but someone tried to call us out on the idea that I think I had said that the rain that was promised at Augusta in Tiger's 2019 round never materialized. And somebody was quick to say, it did rain, though. We watched it rain. Of course, what we meant is the rain that they feared in the late afternoon that would cancel the golf never materialized. They would have been able to play through. So nice try, but the boys are on top on this one.
Indeed, Shane. All right, good section there. We will, of course, cover our categories later on, our awards that we give out. We might mention a few as we go, Shane, but we always like to go in a time machine at the start and take us back to the era, sort of set the scene. And in this one, we probably could choose a few different years to go back, as we'll find out. But let's start with April 1986, Shane. Where was Shane Ryan in April 1986?
Shane Ryan was 3 years old, had never picked up a golf club, I don't think, maybe a toy, hard to say. I'll get with my mom on that one. But yeah, April, 3 years old, just really no memories from that time, Jamie. This is essentially, I was alive, but essentially before my time. What about you?
And this is pre both of us. Yeah, I was just prepping for my first birthday party, so that's I was just a month away from it. So I'm sure I was eager and excited, but not yet touching clubs, not yet seeing the links of Scotland yet. But so it was interesting to dive back into a period that was before us. But we'll get into our time machine, Shane. We'll get back to 1986. Just give people a sense of kind of where we were. So the OWGR officially begins, as we'll see, in April 1986. So let's head back to there. Shane, Ronald Reagan is president of the U.S., and it'll come as maybe little surprise that the U.S. was involved in a conflict in the Middle East, this time with Libya. It seems like a flat circle is happening in all these podcasts that we talk about, but I find it interesting going into some movie research, Shane. You dived into the movies last time, sort of projecting some categories from the Oscars that maybe were relevant for the subject we were talking about. Police Academy 3 was the #1 movie, and you may say to yourself that's got no relevance to what we're talking about, other than being a great third sequel to a good series of movies. But let me tell you some of the other movies that were coming out this year that might have an influence or a mirror to what was going on with the world rankings at the time. We had Crocodile Dundee that had just come out, Shane.
Wow, okay.
A story of a brash, topless, sometimes blonde Australian coming over to the US, trying to make his way and prove his worth. Maybe like somebody we're going to get into or somebody we've already covered in the podcast. Then we're just about a couple of months away from Top Gun coming out. This is 1986. So the idea of the best coming together to decide who is truly the best. Again, something we'll probably dive into. And then last one, if you would spare me here, Shane, is Rocky IV is still in theaters. It came out at the end of 1985, but it's still in theaters. Of course, the story of Americans competing outside the US to see really who is the best of the best in potentially a major sporting event. So there you go.
Well, that is fantastic, Jamie. I also just would like to note that there are plenty of disasters around this time. The Challenger shuttle disaster, the Chernobyl disaster. However, it is a great time for Chicago sports, so a real mixed bag. The Bears have won the Super Bowl. Michael Jordan is about to win NBA Rookie of the Year. And Jamie, I don't know if you had one of these when you were a kid. I certainly did. Nintendo had just released their first gaming system. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think this is a little bit before my time. I'm trying to remember. I think I had a Sega Mega Drive. It was like an early one. I remember playing some game on the golf game on the Game Boy. Was it Mario Golf maybe? Honestly, I still, when I play golf with people, it annoys them. If you hit the green in Mario Golf on the Game Boy, it used to make this sort of jingle that was, you had a birdie try coming up. So anytime I hit a green or see somebody hit a green, I still think of this do birdie try. But so maybe we can incorporate that into future pods anytime we're covering an event where somebody hits a green in regulation.
Yeah, I would love that. So let's go to 1986 in golf. So this is late in the era of Jack Nicklaus, Tom Watson, etc. It is early, however, in the era of the oncoming European golfers. This is sort of around the time when the tide is going to change in the Ryder Cup, but the influx of more talent across the globe is really one of the reasons why the rankings are necessary at this point in the game. So Jack Nicklaus, 46 years old, 6 years on from his last major win. Probably pretty sad that the rankings came too late for him, right? Oh, wait, no. He won the Masters in the very first week of their existence. Of course, we all know that 1986 Masters, one of the legendary Sundays of all time. The reigning major winners before him, Bernard Langer had won, Andy North at the U.S. Open, PGA was Hubert Green, and Sandy Lyle had captured that 85 Open. Lanny Watkins is the reigning player of the year. He and Curtis Strange had both won 3 times in America in 1985. And again, this is Europe time, Jamie. It's a time you would have loved. Seve won the Masters in 80, won it in 83, Langer in 85. Europe had won the Ryder Cup for the first time ever in 85 on their home soil, and we're about to do the unthinkable and beat the Americans on their soil in 1987. And all of this stuff is going to feature in our subject, the OWGR.
Indeed. And Shane, one of the things I wanted to do throughout the podcast was sprinkle in some OWGR facts diving into who's been ranked the highest, one of the cool things about the OWGR is, and kind of why we're going to see that it started was essentially a talking point. And people have talked about it ever since. Who's going to get to world number one? How many weeks have they spent at world number one? And I am very much a student of this, so I'm going to sprinkle in some facts. So the first fact for you is that we are currently living, as we speak right now, in a world where Justin Rose is a top 5 golfer in the world in the official Golf World Rankings. And somebody asked me on Twitter this week if he is the oldest player to ever be ranked inside the top 5. Shane, he is not. But could you name any of the players that were older than Justin Rose and ranked inside the top 5?
The sad part is I saw you tweet about this the other day. And I'm still going to get it wrong. All I can think in my head is Colin Montgomery, and I know it's not right. Was it Sandy Lyle? No, it wasn't him.
A lot of
I don't
Scotch.
know, Jamie.
You're just trying to speak to my heart here. But
I'm just going with all your own people to try to curry favor.
No, it was not.
No, I don't know, Jamie.
The oldest that I could find was Jumbo Ozaki. He was ranked number 5 in the world when he was 50. Kenny Perry and VJ were also older than Justin Rose. But just one of the facts there. We'll sprinkle some more as we go in. But let's dive in to the official Golf World Rankings. Do you know what? I always keep calling it the official Golf World Rankings, which is wrong. And people call me out on this because it's OWGR. So I'm going to have to
World Golf. Yeah,
I'm going to have to correct this as we go. It doesn't flow nicely to me. So maybe this will be the elephant.
I think let's just go with Ogre. Let's just Ogre the whole time.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we're going to start a little bit before it officially starts with the architect of this all, and probably the man who many maybe don't understand that much. And I thought, Shane, we'll maybe play good cop, bad cop, because when we did our research, you found a lot of maybe controversial, some insider knowledge about him, and I, being the optimist, had glass half full, found him to be a delightful man who never did anything wrong and never crossed anyone. So
okay.
I'll introduce him, and then you can knock it out of the park and tell us what he was really like. But this is, of course, Mark McCormack. Mark McCormack was born in 1930. Ironically, he was born in Chicago, and we talked about it being a good time in Chicago in 1986, so he will essentially play a part in that. He was married to a tennis player named Betsy Nagelson. She was 26 years his junior. I didn't realize that until I went through it all. Wow. But she was a 2-time Grand Slam winner in doubles. She also reached the final of the 1978 Australian Open in tennis. And file that away a little bit because McCormack has a big role to play in both tennis and golf and sport in general. But one of the defining moments of McCormack's life happened when he was 6. He was hit by a car, fractured his skull. He was otherwise all right, but his dad convinced him that he couldn't play contact sports. He couldn't play American football, baseball, basketball like all the other kids were, but his dad was a passionate golfer, so told him to get into golf, and that is essentially going to lead us to why me and you are sitting on a podcast right now. So,
Jamie, can I just point out real quickly a thematic thing I noticed? Mark McCormack is hit by a car. Okay. Greg Norman in our first podcast ran over a kangaroo in his car.
I can see where you're going.
Tiger Woods, of course, right after our podcast, flipped his car. There's a I hate to say it, there's a car crash theme going on here, Jamie, along with the potential just subject curse of what we've talked about.
We're going to have to cover, who was it, Jerry Pate at the 1991 Ryder Cup or something next that has a car accident.
Yeah, that's right.
But McCormack's mum played a pivotal role. I enjoyed this story. So McCormack's mum used to moan at him when he was young for not getting enough sleep. So from that day on, McCormack, who was a lover of stats and data when he was young, began tracking his sleep. And I think both you and I spoke to our leader-in-chief, Jerry Tardy, the famous Golf Digest head for many, many years, many decades, about Mark McCormack, because he interacted with him. We have not. McCormack passed in 2003. But he said that anytime you met him, he would have on him little sort of note cards that would be tracking how much sleep he had, along with a whole bunch of other things that he tracked. But that kind of leads into what his stat keeping, his bookkeeping, and why he might start ranking golfers. But just file that one away for just now. Shane, as we said, he was a good golfer. He took his golf career even further. He won the Chicago Prep title as an amateur. He would go on to captain the William and Mary golf team, where he, again, in a sort of sliding doors moment, met a man named Arnold Palmer, who played against him for Wake Forest. McCormack was a good golfer. He played in the 1958 US Open. He played in several US amateurs and British amateurs. But after leaving William and Mary, he chose not to pursue a career in golf and essentially went to Yale to study law and then joined a Cleveland law firm. But there's a point at which he maybe is getting bored of everyday law, and he used his love of sports to arrange these one-day exhibitions for golf pros. So this is really early in golf. Bear in mind, the first televised golf event, I had to look this up, Shane. The first televised golf event was the 1954 Masters. So this is the 1950s we're talking about. So golf is not really on TV. These pros aren't yet superstars. He would arrange these exhibitions for players like Arnold Palmer to come and sort of put on a display for a fee. And it was at that point where Arnold Palmer and Mark McCormack became very close. And this is maybe the biggest tipping point of the whole story because it landed up with Arnold Palmer and Mark McCormack shaking hands on a deal for McCormack to become Arnold Palmer's agent. And Shane, I feel like you can take it from here. This is a man who had no enemies, had no negatives about him. He was just a thoughtful, lovely man trying to help out another man in his pursuit of a professional golf, right?
Well, Jamie, I am sorry to tell you, when it came to Mark McCormack, there was a dark side, and it was a dark and stormy side. And Jamie, as we're doing this, I have to talk about sports agents, and that I'm very biased because they are the natural enemy of the journalist. So as I'm saying this, if you kind of sense me spitting with bile while I'm discussing them, just forgive me. But no, Mark McCormack, Jamie, is this unbelievable historical figure who in a lot of ways doesn't get enough credit. You can argue credibly that he invented the role of the sports agent. He was somebody, to borrow a phrase that Paul McGinley loves to use, he could see around corners. He was somebody who had an incredible vision, and especially when it came to making money. And as you alluded to, he's also this guy who's really, really good at making powerful friends. So you can imagine at William and Mary, right? Arnold Palmer is this big name. He's going to be famous, all that. And McCormack basically becomes best friends with him. He's that kind of guy. He can kind of get in there, a lot of charisma. He is described by an old Golf Digest article as a tall, handsome man. This is when he was 48 years old. As you alluded to, he had blonde hair. It was turning gray by that point. But we went through all the stuff that you talked about, the handshake deals with Palmer. His first three clients, Jamie, were Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, and Gary Player. That is a pretty good trio, right? That was the original big three in a lot of ways. And in fact, that phrase, the big three, McCormack coined himself. He was very good at promoting himself, very good at promoting his clients, but of course it was justified at that time. So McCormack goes on to make the management of athletes this huge business. His company that he starts in 1960 is called IMG. That will be familiar to almost everybody, the International Management Group. It represents athletes, and the list of athletes it goes on to represent are, you know, Muhammad Ali, Tiger Woods, Michael Schumacher, Serena Williams, David Beckham, Joe Montana, the athlete Kate Moss, we have listed here, Jim Nance, and then he also works with organizations like the RNA, he represents them, the Kennedy Space Center, the Pope, Jamie, the Smithsonian. I mean, incredible stuff. He would have been very much at odds with Trump over this recent Pope stuff, But talking about that dark side, let's look at some of the contemporary pieces that were written about him back when he was alive. E.M. Swift, who was a great writer at Sports Illustrated, in 1990, he kind of laid it all out. Even at that time in 90, that's about 30 years after he gets going. There's more than 1,000 employees at IMG, more than $700 million in revenue. Some people at the company are going, we're growing too fast. We can't keep up with how much money we're making. And this was what was crazy to me, Jamie. You would think an agent's fee is 10%, right? That's the number that we always kind of bandy about. It could go as high as 50% of a player's total earnings. That's how much McCormack and his team were taking. So IMG today, it's owned by Endeavor. It had merged with William Morris. There's a lot going on. It's no longer, at a certain point it stops being McCormack's thing, but he is the architect of it all. So talking about that 50%, the average, 50% was the high number. The average was they would take 25%. Listen to what McCormack says about that in E.M. Swift's piece. And why not? We have the context, we have the expertise, and we have the clients. We don't do anything for 10%. So that gives you a sense of who this guy was and, the kind of, I don't know if arrogance is the right word, but cockiness that goes behind him. Jamie, other things he established, official films. And in fact, I think, you were the one who brought this up, so I'm going to kick this to you quickly. But, when we talk about what did he do with Wimbledon, because the Wimbledon story, I think, is very funny and also very representative of how his tentacles were everywhere.
Yeah, it was hard to find a lot of videos, interviews with Mark. Like we said, he passed in 2003. He didn't do very many interviews, but he did do one of my favorite, I call it a podcast, but it's a radio show, is the BBC Desert Island Discs. Just a long form interview where they pick 6 songs, but they're talking about their careers. And they did, Mark McCormack was a guest in the late 1970s. And he comes across, as you say, a little bit straight, a little bit square, very confident. But he did talk about how the biggest impact he feels he made in his career was how he transformed Wimbledon. So as we said, he was interested in tennis as a youngster. He's actually one of the few people who would end up being inducted into the Golf and Tennis Hall of Fame. So I can't think there would be anybody else that's done that. But when he first attended Wimbledon, he was blown away by the colors of Wimbledon, the white outfits that they would wear. It had a distinct brand. But he left it thinking there was a little bit more there. And being Mark McCormack as he was, he ended up reaching out and trying to speak to the higher-ups that ran Wimbledon. At that point, he was a sports agent, and he could sort of call on meetings like that. And he suggested to them things like catering at the event and big screens and putting areas for fans to go away from when they were watching the tennis. And everybody at Wimbledon thought that the ideas that he was coming out with were good, but didn't know who was going to fund it. And that's where McCormack suggested that IMG would fund it. And Wimbledon said, well, how would we pay you? And that's where he started to negotiate things like television rights and the rights to the official film. He said you should document every year at Wimbledon like it's a movie, and then sort of distribute that movie around the world, and I can help you do that. And already I think you're going to tell us that's kind of where McCormack's brain would always work. He'd be working kind of multiple sides often of the same sort of deal. And to your point about becoming the super agent within the sport, that's kind of where that comes from, is that ability to, as you said, see round corners, but see opportunity on kind of both sides of the deal.
Yeah, there's an old Ross Goodner piece at Golf Digest, and he kind of sums this up. He says, what McCormack does so effectively is work both sides of the street. He puts together package deals in which all the parties involved are clients of his. For example, he might create a tournament for which he would sell the sponsorships, provide the players, negotiate the television rights, and market a film afterward, and collect a percentage from all the parties as the representatives. So it's a good system if you can get it. But Jamie, I did allude to his dark side, and I don't want to keep you on tenterhooks. From an old Sports Illustrated piece, this is the lead. He has been called Mark the Knife in New Zealand, the traveling computer in France, the Midas of muscle, and in the U.S., well, take your pick. Parasite, megalomaniac, and cold fish are a few of the more endearing appraisals, okay? There are former employees who are calling him vindictive, vicious, a manipulator. He was accused, Jamie, and I think there's a certain brilliance in this, of using speakerphones in his Cleveland office to spy on people. So basically there's speakers where you can connect to anybody, but all he had to do was press a button to hear exactly what was being talked about in any office in the building. And he seems like exactly the kind of man who would have abused that type of system. There was a Fortune 500 exec in a different story that said, quote, my stomach tells me that McCormack is the ultimate hustler, that he will use you to the nth degree. There's something shady and unattractive about him. Doesn't give much eye contact. I wish I could be more specific. It's just a feeling I have. So there is that side of him. There's this side that people aren't really trusting him. But I think like a lot of good sports agents, there are many people who despise you, but the people who don't are the people you're working for because you're very good and you're making a lot of money. But I don't think we can give short shrift to the intellectual side of him, Jamie. And of course, he is the inventor of OWGR, as we're calling it. But you talked about the stats he liked to do. But he was prolific. He wrote 13 books in total. These are kind of, as you might expect, sort of businessy self-help books. He is constantly negotiating, marketing, all that kind of stuff. He is named the most powerful man in sports by the Sporting News in 1990. And in 1994, Sports Illustrated called him one of the 40 most significant sports figures of the past 40 years. And speaking of how sort of, I think prescient is a good word, seeing around corners. Jamie, you found a speech from him around this time that I loved, and hopefully I think this will be a nice segue into where we're going. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, this speech was on a website dedicated to McCormack, and it was actually a speech he gave in 1974 on the future of sport, but he focused on golf at that point. Like we talked about before, he'd signed the big three in the game, he'd coined them the big three, and this is the start of his speech. So just bear in mind, this is written, over 50 years ago. So McCormack said, "The sport of golf on a worldwide basis stands at a critical crossroad as the 1974 season moves into high gear. There exist, to begin with, some broad problems that are not within the purview of the sport itself, but may affect it and all of us adversely. One is a sense of general malaise, the notion that we never had it so good but never felt worse. The fear that we are headed into a difficult era, one that might involve substantive changes in our more materialistic concepts of life. Such things could alter our very attitude toward big-time professional sport." And that gives you, like I said, that's over 50 years ago. He's speaking to a whole bunch of different sports execs. Again, remember, he is the super agent that's thinking behind this. But one other quote that I liked of his at this time, Shane, that I didn't share with you, but I found in an interview with him, was that he said sport was an hour or two on a Saturday afternoon, maybe one page in a morning paper. But today, this is talking in the 90s, today sports is 15 pages of its own in every section of every newspaper and primetime television everywhere. So he sort of saw that coming. He saw the growth of TV. Like we said, it just started within golf in the 50s. He signed the three biggest players in the sport. He created a lot of the events that would lead into golf. The World Match Play at Wentworth was one that he talked about. Designing the World Match Play, finding the course, selling the idea of it to TV, and then supplying all the players as well that were going to play in it. And finally, just one wrap-up quote from Arnold Palmer on Mark McCormack that sort of gives the sense of just how important he was. Palmer said in the early 2000s, "I think through the years he has probably had as much influence on sports generally as anyone. He's touched on just about everything in the sporting world." Shane, that gives us a little bit of a flavor of the man. But before we get to the rankings, I promise you a fact at the end of every chapter, so I'll give you another one here, and then you can take us towards the rankings. Shane, there's been a lot of players that have reached world number one. There's 25 different players that have reached world number one. Did you know that there's 16 players that have reached world number two and never reached world number one? So the perennial bridesmaids. And Phil Mickelson is one of those. Phil Mickelson has spent 270 weeks at world number two without ever reaching world number one. That's more than the other 15 world number twos combined. So he spent more than 5 years seeing his name at number two on a ranking list. And as we've talked about before, I can't imagine anybody would have hated that more than Phil Alfred Mickelson.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Jamie, so one thing I love about Mark McCormack as we get into the OWGR, as we get into OWGR, is that today when we talk about people who are successful, we usually talk about, in business especially, manipulating the structures that exist in the world. Mark McCormack was somebody who could do that, but what we keep hinting at, and which is really remarkable about him, is that if a structure doesn't exist, he has the brain power to invent it and then manipulate it. Okay, so what would you need to do you think, if you're somebody who represents a lot of tennis players and a lot of golfers, and you want to kind of market them the best you can? Well, you would probably want a world ranking, right? You would want to be able to say there are no standings in golf at the time. You know, there's a money list, but how compelling is that? You want to be able to say, I have the number one golfer in the world. So McCormack has this guy who loves numbers, keeps scrupulous notes, counts how many times he sleeps and how long he sleeps at night. So he is going to be the guy to do it. He's going to be the guy to invent this system. So before the start of OWGR in 1986, an unofficial end-of-year World Golf Rankings were published by him in his publication he called the World of Professional Golf Annual, and that's from 1968 to 1985. And there's a nice line from Wikipedia here that says, unlike their replacement, they were not used to select fields for tournaments and served no real purpose other than as a talking point. So for, again, what is that? I'm not good at math, but 17 years, he's keeping track of all this stuff. And I'm sure there's a business interest of it when it comes to McCormack. But I like to think he's the kind of guy who also just likes to know. He just likes to do it for the discussion purpose. There's a little bit of Bill James in him, a way more ambitious, way more cutthroat Bill James, the guy who just likes this stuff.
I find it funny when he says it's nothing more than just a talking point, but that's exactly what an agent needs, right? Is a talking point. How often are they sat talking to people, talking to sponsors, talking to events? So the talking point maybe serves a purpose for IMG and himself, but I enjoy the fact that it's just an amateur ranking as well. Like I feel like we should maybe start our 50 things like amateur ranking and just see where that goes, just based on vibes, nothing else.
Well, our whole premise is essentially an amateur ranking, so I think we might already be there.
That's true. Yeah. In design, we're already there.
Yeah, we've done it. So these rankings he does, these sort of preliminary rankings, what he's doing that nobody else had done before is he's taking account of pro tours from across the world. So the U.S., of course, also Europe, but then also Japan, Africa, Australia. I mean, he's seeing things, how it can become global. The concepts are similar to what you see now in OWGR. 3-year rolling rankings, more recent events count for more points awarded for the big events like majors and, the tour events with really strong fields. McCormack was a guy who always believed that winning should account for a lot. It should really matter. So he would give more points to the winners. They got extra points. And at majors, at least, only finishes in the top 10 would receive points. And so to look back at who he had, Jack Nicklaus was his number one golfer from 68 to 77. Tom Watson takes over from 78 to 82. And then Seve Ballesteros becomes the number one player in the world from 83 to 85. And so, by the way, we should mention, we talked about the big three that he had. Jack Nicklaus fairly quickly, Jamie, left McCormack, didn't he?
Yeah. So we talked about these rankings beginning in 1968. It was about 1970 that Jack sort of split off and went on his own. I think potentially, the big three idea of McCormack representing all three was something that didn't quite land with Jack at that time. Yeah. This is peak Jack. I mean, this is him winning majors on a regular basis. By the time the rankings come around, 1986, he's, of course, at the latter end of his career. But at this point, I think he wanted sort of his own shop and his own attention. So he split off. But it is interesting that one of McCormack's players was ranked number one for the first 9 years of the ranking. I would say, we talked about it there being the 3-year rolling period of scores counting. Someone, and I'll try and find them credit and give them credit in the next episode, but they did go back and see if it was a 2-year rolling period like it is now, that Gary Player and Ray Floyd would have also reached world number one in that time. So, these guys that existed in pre-OWGR worlds maybe aren't quite credited the same as a Tom Lehman or a David Duval is now, that have reached sort of the summit of the game, but those two would have made it there as well. But there was a thinking at that time that maybe these rankings were going to annoy some people in the game, Shane, and I think you maybe dug up an old friend of yours that you've spoken to on the phone recently that maybe disagreed with Mark's premise.
Dean Beeman, not a fan of Mark McCormack, very much at odds with him. And they were friends earlier, but then when it started to become, about business, Dean Beeman said, because Dean Beeman, of course, is a great golfer himself. So you can imagine as young men, they're all around each other. They're very friendly, and they grow up to be stark adversaries. So here's a quote from Dean Beeman very recently in 2022 on a call with Golf Digest, who said of McCormack that one of his goals was to get more of his international players into more tournaments so they could make more money, so he could make more money. It wasn't altruistic. Before I became commissioner, which was in 1974, we were pretty close, but not afterward. My job was to look out for all the players. He was looking out just for his players. And I would, caution people that when Dean Beeman's saying this, Dean Beeman has an agenda too. Not that what he's saying isn't true, but, grain of salt type stuff. So, of course, McCormack would dispute that opinion and claim that his efforts were to grow the game of golf and conversations around it, which it has. And so I think it's very easy to look very cynically at Mark McCormack, especially for me, having looked up I'm the bad cop, Jamie. But I think he did accomplish these things that he set out to do. There was obviously self-interest, but I think there is a high tide that is raising all ships. So to that end, let's go ahead to 1985 on the doorstep of these things becoming official. He wrote a memo to the LPGA, Jamie. This is a little footnote, but one we want to mention, with an ambition to bring a similar ranking to the women's games. So I won't read you this ranking, but essentially he's sending it to the powers that be, saying this is what we need to do. We need to have this also. And that didn't pan out. The rankings that are used in the women's game today are not actually part of OWGR. But again, you see that McCormack kind of thinks of everything, and his ambition is all-encompassing, and so is his vision of where the game was going. So we have McCormack's rankings. We have his unbelievable ambition. We have controversy. But what are we missing, Jamie?
Yeah, so at this point, he is already in discussion with the RNA. He's already in discussion with some of the tours. There's an interest there for them to share in the rankings as well. But one thing they're missing is money. And Mark McCormack is usually pretty good at getting that at this point. So they need a sponsor. This is a funny era of sport. They need a sponsor for it to cover the costs of computing. You know, computing costs didn't come on an iPhone back then. I actually spoke to the OWGR representatives ahead of this, and they said that they had a very huge old computer that they would have to file. They would actually have all the tournaments around the world be faxing them the results, and they would have to manually put them in. So it takes some computing power as well as the cost of the human analyst. So they went RFP the route, and they reached out to companies. The first company that reached out to them was Panasonic. So they pitched them at that time. Atari was sponsoring the ATP rankings, and so they came up with a proposal very similar. They wanted to change McCormack's rankings a little bit to mirror more of the ATP rankings, which we'll get into exactly how they work a little bit later on. But regardless of that, although he was a tennis fan, he didn't like the fact that they were trying to change his methodology. So they were out, and next up came Sony. So Sony reached out, and they were keen to sponsor the rankings. They were keen to get involved into golf. And in 1985, in October, they sent a memo back to Mark with some requirements. And I laughed at this, Shane, because it's very, very on golf sponsorship that we're talking about something that's going to change the game forever. And yet the holding up points in this memo are things like a hospitality marquee for 2 days at one specific event, the ability to host a golf outing, and the desire to conduct a press conference when it all is wrapped up. But alas, Mark gave in to all three, and Sony were happy. And thus, in the first week of April 1986, Shane, the Sony Golf World Rankings were released for the very first time. And I think that is probably a good place for us to break before we get into the. Oh,
but wait, Jamie, one moment. But wait. You say we're gonna take a break. I support you. I like a good break as much as anyone. But like a good drug dealer, you have given out the first facts, these OWGR facts. You've given them out for free, and you've got me addicted. I'm over here shaking. I need one more fact before we go to break.
Okay, I'll give you this one, Shane. I would like to invite you, it's actually just a couple of weeks from when we're recording, but I would like to invite you to celebrate Tom Lehman Week with me, Shane. You might be confused as to what I'm talking about, but Tom Lehman is the only golfer to ever be ranked world number one for 1 week. His week happened the week of April 20th, 1997, and every year, Shane, I like to get into a fresh pair of Dockers, crack open a beer, rewatch the 1996 Open Championship that he won, and just celebrate everything about Tom Lehman. And so would you be interested in joining me this year?
Absolutely. I am in. But first, Jamie, there's some business to get to. When we come back, we are going into the modern era of OWGR.
It is complicated, but it's beautifully complicated. The way some things have to be beautifully complicated in order to function accurately. If we built our roads or buildings or airplanes or cars without obeying some pretty naughty mathematical formulas, we'd live in a state of constant ruin. I'm not saying the world rankings are as important as our infrastructure, but they do require a bit of complexity. Welcome back to the 50 Things That Change Golf podcast. That reading was from a 2015 Golf Digest piece titled, Golf World Rankings Are Almost Perfect, and if you don't get them, that's your problem. Shane, have you read that piece by any chance?
I have read that piece, Jamie, by one Shane Ryan. Another, along with car crashes, narcissism is a feature of our podcast.
Yeah, we're always reading our old pieces of yours.
Yeah, I like how you kind of gave me a bit of a Texas accent there, which I've always wanted anyway.
I tried to embrace Shane, but it kind of came out a bit more JFK, I think. But
I'll take it. All right, Jamie, well done. Let us get to the good stuff. The OWGR, the OWGR. We have come to April 1986, and we are reading news. The news has come in that the first official rankings are live. So here is a quote from the first official press release. Quote, "To administer and publish every week a transparent, credible, and accurate ranking based on the relative performances of players participating in male-eligible golf tours worldwide." Mark McCormack, Jamie, as you might guess, was the chairman of what was at that time called the International Advisory Committee that oversaw these rankings. And it was essentially then an extension of IMG. And the first system they used was based almost exactly on those rankings we had spoken about that McCormack had been doing for years. So what do the first rankings look like? Well, again, this comes out a week before the Masters that year in 86. They rank the top 200 golfers, and they're using 150 rated events. So they're going into the past to do this. In the very first Sony ranking, I'm looking at it here, it's this beautiful, it looks like it was typed on the oldest typewriter that you've ever seen.
Just the font. The font is very old school and typewriter-ish, but I am sure this was faxed around the world.
It looks like a batting order from RBI Baseball, the very first Nintendo game they had. And up first in the batting order is Bernard Langer, is the number one ranked golfer with 1,056 points. Just behind him, we've got Seve Ballesteros, Sandy Lyle, so the Europeans are controlling it. Finally, an American, thank goodness, Tom Watson, Mark O'Meara, Greg Norman, and it goes on from there. But there is a Japanese player, Tommy Nakajima, is in seventh, so the global nature of this thing is already quite evident. So, two good quotes from that time. I'm going to take the first one, Jamie. I'll give you the second. The first one is from McCormack himself. He says, "We needed a system that reflected performance worldwide, not just in one country."
Dean Beeman disagrees with that, but we'll carry on. I find this next quote from a newspaper article at the time, a British newspaper, and it was from, I really enjoy how this is prepped. So this is Tony Greer, who we're going to meet at this point, Shane. Tony Greer is a friend of Mark McCormack's. He is involved with the rankings initially. And Shane, he is actually still involved in the rankings now. He celebrated his 90th birthday on Friday of the Masters this year, and he still does limited work with the OWGR. So shout out to Tony. But in this newspaper article from 1986, he was introduced as a weekend golfer and an executive at IMG, which I've always found funny that he was a weekend golfer first. He took his weekend golf very seriously, so that it came first. But and
he was a hobbyist. He was a hobbyist when it came to his executive work.
Part-time executive, full-time weekend golfer. But I think this quote speaks to just kind of where the system's going to get, and it's a little bit of the back and forth that we're going to have for the next 40, 50 years. Tony describes the system. Bear in mind, this is published the week of the very first rankings. He says it's not a perfect system, but then no ranking system is. We've tried experiments on every aspect, and we think this system is fair. So that kind of sets up what they're going to go and what's going to happen. So just a very quick note. We're not going to get bogged down in details, but a quick note of how the rankings worked back then. They had 4 tiers of events. So majors were tier 1, and you get points for finishing the top 25. You'd get points in grade 2 events. So that's the leading tours. Think PGA Tour, think European Tour. You'd get points if you finished in the top 10 of those events. Intermediate or lesser tours, that's grade 3, and they would get points in the top 5. And then you'd get a top 3. You get points if you finish in the top 3 of the smallest tour events. They're the sort of more remote tours around the world. The rankings are immediately taken up by the R&A. This is a really key point, and this has got a lot to do with why the rankings were launched at this period, Shane, because as we talked about earlier, Mark started the idea of the rankings as a talking point, but it quickly became interesting to majors such as the R&A as a way to exempt players in, because again, we think now of these players, if you're top 50 in the world, you get into all these events, it doesn't matter. But think back to the 1970s, 1980s, American golfers still had to travel and pre-qualify for the Open. It didn't matter who you were, you still had to travel. You still had to probably take 3 weeks out your schedule, if not more, if you go further back. And so by using the rankings, it essentially told the R&A which players they needed to exempt into the Open. Those Americans then didn't have to qualify, and they could come in a bit later, and they would commit to events like international events like the Open a bit more. So that sets up this idea that the majors are going to use this new official Golf World Rankings. This isn't just an annual anymore, to sort of build out their field. And it's a similar idea as the one in tennis, and that's probably where Mark McCormack gets it from. Shane, I looked into this because actually we're both fairly interested in tennis as it is, and I thought it was an interesting comparison. The sports are relatively similar in singular pursuits, but the ATP began as a men's trade union in 1972. It rose to prominence, there was big events, but it all hit sort of a tipping point at the 1973 Wimbledon when 81 players of the ATP boycotted the event. Just through negotiations with Wimbledon, qualification structures, how they were going to get into the event, they weren't happy, so all the players boycotted the event. And then just 2 months later, in August of that year, the ATP introduced its own ranking system intended to, and in quotes, objectify tournament entry criteria. So again, with the same idea that all these ranking systems, whilst they're fun to debate, whilst they're fun to sort of bash around 19th holes and, like McCormack said, have as a talking point, they essentially are set up to build out the best fields in golf. So, Shane, I thought you'd enjoy this wee nugget from the ATP. Did you know that the computer that spits out the rankings for the ATP is still called Blinky?
How about that? How about that?
You always bring nicknames to this podcast, so I was happy I could bring one. And I want to know, put you on the spot, what would you call the OWGR computer?
Well, I think Mark McCormack would have named it after himself. So I see. Oh,
Mark
it's one of the options you've suggested is Mark 2. But yeah, no, I don't know if you're going to beat Blinky. I might have just sort of given it a different. Isn't that also the name of a Pac-Man villain? I might have given it like Tinky or something like that, just to kind of keep it on theme. So, Jamie McCormack at this point is very much on a mission here, and he wants to get other majors on board. He wants to get all the various tours to endorse the rankings. And, knowing Mark McCormack, I won't be surprised that he managed all of this fairly quickly with all his connections and all the power he wielded just by virtue of having so many players in his stable. So we said he already had the RNA on board. PGA Tour only takes them 4 years, despite Dean Beeman's total antipathy for Mark McCormack. But by 1990, they're on board. And then the other majors are kind of considering it, but they're slower to move, as you might guess. You know what Augusta is like. But after a lengthy meeting at Royal Troon in 1997, all the majors are on board. The tentacles have spread. The McCormackian, Machiavellian machinations are now in full effect. So this is now the measure of deciding the fields for all the biggest events in the game. So let's skip forward a little bit. 2004, Mark McCormack has passed away, as you said, in 2003. And IMG, at this point after his death, gives over the rankings to a company. Now, the company is formed by the majors and the major tours, and the deal is now they are going to oversee the management of OWGR. And where is it run, Jamie? I would assume this is probably run in America, the center of world golf. I'm sure Beeman and Tim Fincham seized control, and it must be in Ponte Vedra Beach. There must be a room in Ponte Vedra Beach where nobody can get in.
Well, I did ask this question actually on a lovely veranda at Augusta National last week when I met with the OWGR people themselves, and they said that it was discussed briefly, but because IMG's rankings were based in London at that time, the idea of keeping them on the same time zone was the prevalent factor here, and so it was decided that the European Tour, now the DP World Tour, would take the management of it and we'd hire staff. So that it was based out of Wentworth and the European Tour, and basically on London times, that's the way all the rankings had come in. Like I said earlier, they would be faxed in. They now all have to adhere to producing results in a very uniform way that can automatically go into the system. But that's why essentially, and actually, as you know, I used to work for the European Tour, and the OWGR office used to be just down the hallway downstairs, and I used to see them a lot. I used to go and bother them with questions all the time. So it's nice that full circle, I'm still bothering them with questions today. So
that's great. Well, Jamie, you are bothering to this day because they still run OWGR to this day. So let me give you a sense of the leadership structure as of 2025. The chairman is Trevor Immelman. Guy Kinnings is on the board. He is, of course, the chief executive of the European Tour Group. Again, this is all of the 2025. Kerry Haig from the PGA of America, Jay Monahan from the PGA Tour, Mark Darbin from the RNA, and Mike Wan from the USGA. And this is a funny bit to me that on the OWGR Wikipedia page, beneath all these very esteemed men, it says, note, one seat is held by a representative from Augusta National. And I like to think that person comes in with a goat mask on and nobody knows his identity.
I just pictured the end of the table when they're having the meetings. You can make out the green jacket, but they're so in shadows you can never quite tell who it is. It's the big boss at the end.
Like there's Jay Monahan arguing for like some change, and everybody's nodding, and all of a sudden the Augusta representative reaches out his hand, and Jay Monahan's choking at the table. The motion fails. So Jamie, that's the setup. I know people are going to be shouting at their cars and phones, desperate to hear the mathematical equation by which these golfers are ranked. But I myself am desperate, Jamie, for another fact, please.
Okay. Maybe we should spin off the facts and have it like as a bonus pod or something. But Shane, I'll give you another one before we get into how the rankings work. Did you know that since the world ranking started in 1986, there have been 160 majors played, including Rory McIlroy's defense of the Masters this year? I want you, Shane, to tell me out of 160 majors, how many of them have been won by players ranked in the OWGR's top 10?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with this year, so that's one. Going back to last year. No, that's a great question. World top 10, boy, it's so easy to be swayed by the modern era where it feels like every major. But I am going to go high. I'm going to go 130 out of those 160.
So 130 out of 160. You're a little bit off, actually. It's actually the minority. So 78 of the majors played have been won by top 10 players.
That's a stunning and great stat.
49% of majors since 1986 have been won by players in the top 10, and 82 or 51% have been won by players outside the top 10. So I find that interesting.
Well, you've made a fool of me, Jamie, but it is a great stat.
Again, one of my goals in all these podcasts is to trick you up with very, very niche trivia. And so I'm glad it is
disappointingly easy for you to do that. All right, let's hear, Jamie. How does this work now? How have things changed? What's going on? What's going on these days?
Yeah, Shane, as we said before, we don't want to get bogged down people too much, but I think it's relatively interesting to understand how it works. So, Shane, you can be the student in this. I'll be the lecturer. You can cut in with questions if you feel. I'll try and wrap this up in 2 minutes. Let's see if we can do it. So, the current OWGR system is a 2-year rolling system. So, like we said before, it measured 3 years of events. It now just measures 2. That was changed in 1995. So just to give perspective there, John Rahm's win at the 2023 Masters now no longer counts at all for his world rankings. He struggles for world ranking points anyway, but that one that he won there has no influence on his ranking anymore. The rankings are based on your point average, not your point total. So the points that you get at events are divided, unlike the ATP, where you just totalize points throughout the year. I think it's your best 18 events on the ATP out of all the events you play. For golf, it is an average. Points are given based on the strength of field. You get 100 points if you win a major, 80 points if you win a Players, 70 points if you win a signature event, around 50 points for a regular tour event, and there is McCormack would love this. There is a multi-win bonus. So players like Chris Gotter up this year, who've won multiple times, you get a little bit of a boost. It's not too much, but it is there to sort of recognize form and streaks and players that are playing very well in a condensed time. To give you an idea of how the points are counted, so there's 2 years of events. If you picture a graph, Shane, you have 13 events that count for full points, and then every event from the 13 weeks all the way back to 2 years are downgraded until they get to 0 at 2 years in a flat line. Now, it used to be that they would drop off in periods, but they saw some discrepancies there that they didn't like. So again, as a minor tweak back to what Tony Greer said, that they would always be tweaking the system. So your 13 most recent weeks count full, and then exponentially down to 2 years where they have no value. And then the minimum events that you can be divided by to get your points is 40. Again, I brought this up last week because there was an interesting period in golf in the mid-2000s when you had the likes of Tiger Woods showing up for WGCs and majors and very few other events other than ones he was maybe sponsored in, Buicks. And then you had players like Vijay Singh that were playing 34, 35 times a year and were maybe being hurt by playing too many. So they came up with the rule that regardless of how many events you play within the 2 year period, you're going to be divided by 40 and you can't play you can't have more than 52 count. So it's essentially the Tiger and VJ rule. I went back and saw that Tiger since since 2005, Shane, Tiger's only played more than 20 events in one season. Obviously, recently he's had injuries and things, but even in that sort of 2013 peak where he got back to world number one, he still wasn't playing 20 events. So he was technically hurting himself in the rankings, but yet still dominating the rankings. So but very quickly, Shane, about the 2021 changes, we talked about the fact that they are willing to adapt. And again, something that the OWGR people were telling me last week, they're always making minor tweaks, but the big change that people will remember was 2021, headlines about strokes gained. This was essentially the idea that before it was only essentially the top 200 players in the world that would add world ranking points to events. They had the huge impact and nobody else really did. So they kind of got the feeling that field, with the increase in the number of pro golfers that were playing, the number of tours there were, that it wasn't maybe an accurate measure. So now every player in OWGR's rankings are given a strokes gained rating, and that rating is based on scores that they've played and adjusted for field strength. And then that's the rating that they then bring to events, and that's how performance points are decided for events. It's not just how many top 200 players are they in the top 10, are they in the top 20 that brings it anymore. Every player brings their own value to an event, and that's how fields are measured now. So a quick background into how it's worked. So that was OWGR 101 as you were, but how did I do?
Beautifully, Jamie. I think that was well laid out, very clear and concise. And really, I mean, I think it's a great system. I mean, in my mind, nothing could ever go wrong from there, right? Wait a moment. Cue Greg Norman's entrance music, which I imagine to be Waltzing Matilda or I Come From a Land Down Under.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe Waltzing Matilda. There's a slightly more ominous tone to that. So what originally began, Jamie, when this started with just 6 tours involved in OWGR, grew to 24 tours by the mid-2000s. That, for me, that's too many tours. It's not a big enough club, but good for them. But the one tour that threatened to spoil the entire sauce, if that's a phrase, the one tour that threatened to spoil the sauce was, of course, Live Golf. And Jamie, I love this. You dug this up. I'm going to read it. I'm going to take the glory, but you're the one who found it.
Yeah, go for it.
He may actually have predicted, he being Mark McCormack, may have actually predicted Live. This goes back to that 1974 speech. He's talking about sponsors and how they're trying to make a profit. And listen to what he says, quote, "Past loyalty on the part of the sponsor to the PGA counts for nothing when a more lucrative sponsor comes along." That's obviously true, Jamie. He goes on, "The attitude of the majority of the players, and it's they're the ones who set the policies, long has been, what's in it for us?" And Jamie, here's how he concludes, and I love this. "The main cloud on this horizon is, again, the international economic picture. If only the Arabs played golf."
It's unbelievable. It's so
Like this guy there's nothing he didn't envision. And he goes on to say, in the year 2020, a global pandemic is going to happen because of a mutation in the SARS virus. But no, I mean, come on. Is this not the craziest thing you've ever heard? And he also goes on to say here, if nothing else, the U.S. Tour must find a way to guarantee the appearance of its stars at certain designated events. It's just astounding, right?
It's amazing. I need to go. I think I sent you the PDF. It was 21 pages long of his speech, but I need to go back, print it out, and memorize it, and maybe start gambling on this stuff because true Nostradamus stuff going on here.
Yeah, if there is an apocalypse, something like this may be the new Bible as we sort of rebuild our civilization. He predicted everything. Okay, Jamie, so it's 2021, and Live, backed by the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia with its $1 trillion, starts to lure players away from the PGA Tour. You may have missed this, but it was a big dramatic thing a couple years ago. And they're coming from the DP World Tour too, of course. Sacks of cash, the promise of even more, and importantly, the expectation that they would get OWGR points and therefore still be relevant in this game and qualify into the majors. But Jamie, that wasn't quite that straightforward. You led us through, what it looks like today. You did the yeoman's work. I'll try to do it here with what the criteria really is to get these points. So, first of all, tours have got to have pathways. You've got to have a Q school, Monday qualifying, things like that. Liv doesn't have this, right? Because they're buying and selecting their players. They do eventually get some promotion and relegation. That does become an important part and sort of a light version of a qualifying school, but not right away. Point 2, tours must not discriminate on access. You can't discriminate, of course, on age, race, nationality. But a lot of people think LIV doesn't comply here because when you have teams that we're going to say, okay, this is our Korean team or these are our Southern Knights from South Africa or whatever, that does seem a little bit like we're on the path of discrimination in a weird way. Number 3, tours have got to have membership rules of codes and conduct. And here, LIV is just the wild, wild west. They've got music playing. They're allowed to wear shorts. It offends the dignity of every professional golfer, Jamie. And, look, Sergio Garcia's in there. How can you have a code of conduct when he's out there doing what he does? So, and then finally, the tours have got to comply with certain tournament rules. So it's got to have majority stroke play events, which LIV does. Got to have a minimum of 10 Order of Merit events. Again, LIV checks that box. An average field size of at least 75 players. Nope. And an average purse of at least $30,000, which LIV barely just covers. So, Jamie, is there anything to add there? I mean, I don't know if you're a LIV bot, if you're ready to strike me down for my harsh but accurate depiction here, but how did I do?
I'm going to attack you like a swarm of bees here with all your blasphemy. But yeah, I think the $30,000 minimum purse size is, I think they just get that when you remember that the last place finisher in a LIV event gets $48,000. But one detail you left out that I really enjoyed going back through all my OWGR research that I shared with you previously is the fact that if you have an OWGR ranking event as a tour, the playoff hole has to be more than 85 yards. I was giggling away with the thought that if the 2023 US Open had gone to a playoff and they took it, you might remember that the 15th hole that week when Wyndham Clark won, the 15th hole played 82 yards on Sunday. It had that really hard small green, and I like to think that if they by mistake taken the playoff with him and Rory back to that hole, that Wyndham Clark might have avoided his only major win, and some OWGR person would have been on the phone. Probably me. I think I would have called up immediately.
It would have been. I think they should have gotten the Oakmont guys to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Preemptively, but no, you didn't miss much. But to play devil's advocate here, a lot of people on LIV, Greg Norman himself, not in the Surely You Jest letter famously, but in subsequent letters to the OWGR, were quick to point out that the PGA Tour does have a lot of no-cut events. The new signature model that was being sort of run out in reaction to LIV had a lot more events that were offering no cuts, similar to the old WGCs, and LIV felt that their events were pretty similar. And one of the main sort of poster events that LIV people would, or LIV players and agents and administrators would point to is this Tiger's event in the Bahamas, the Hero World Challenge. You'll remember that happens in December every year. It started as just a 16-man field in 2000. It was the top 11 players, I think, that wanted, from the world rankings, that wanted to play, plus the defending champion, plus 4 sponsor invites. They played for a prize fund that was equivalent to a tour event. I think back then it was right on par with anything below the players and below the majors. And starting in 2009, Shane, or starting in 2010, sorry, given in 2009, it was granted OWGR points. Bear in mind, this is just a 20-person no-cut event. And the belief was that the strength of the players that were in this field made it stronger than most PGA Tour events. It was, Tiger was inviting his friends, essentially, but they were all the best players in the world. Europeans would always show up and play it. But it was controversial that it had no cut. It was this very, very limited field, even smaller than LIV, and it was getting OWGR points. So it was kind of the poster child. And when I noted that when Jim Furyk won in 2009, he jumped from 11th to 6th in the world and got the same amount of world ranking points as Brian Gay, who won the RBC Heritage that year. So it just gives you a sense. So there was reason to believe that the rules were maybe being bent or skewed for certain events and some of the PGA Tour events. So there's a decent case there, Shane. But did I convince you that LIV should have got OWGR points right away?
No, they can kick rocks as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, fair. But things would change, Shane.
How dare they? No, of course there are some good points. And there's a lot that's happening here, Jamie, that reeks of sort of the subtle ways in which powerful people maintain their power, even in the face of new money, even in the face of these nouveau riche bourgeoisie people that come in and try to upset the apple cart, which you and I both hate as guardians of old money. But so now we're going to talk about, Jamie, how LIV does get OWGR points. It is basically in February 2026, just this year, we learn that LIV will now get these points. Hooray, they've been advocating it forever, right? This is great. Well, as it turns out, only the top 10 players are going to get points. And what this does is it effectively takes the air out of the ball. Because what happens? If you're someone who's casually following golf, or you're kind of like on the fence about who to support in this stuff, and you hear LIV has been complaining about these world ranking points, well, now they have them, and look at them. They're still complaining. These guys, nothing will ever make them happy. But actually, they basically got stiffed, right? It's like an appearance of giving them what they want while almost diminishing them and humiliating them in the process. And it's reminiscent a little bit of how the majors dealt with LIV, quite frankly, where at first we're like, how are you going to get in? Because you need world ranking points to get into majors, and they're not having those. A lot of them are dropping. Well, we're going to give special exemptions to a few guys. And it's placatory, but it doesn't really give LIV everything they want. It doesn't give them the respect that they want. And so, again, that's just like this subtle thing of, here's a little thing that's going to shut you up, and everybody's going to turn the other way because they're sick of hearing about it, but you're really not getting much at all.
It almost seemed to upset everyone at the same time as appease everyone, which is a pretty impressive thing to do. But I do think it's worth pointing out at this point, and I feel like I'm hitting the nail right on top of the head with how obvious this is, but this is a tour that was set up with the letters LIV meaning 54, and they, at this point, prior to 2026, had lengthened their events to 72 holes to appease the OWGR, essentially only to get world ranking points. And I think it was John Ram and Bryson said that they weren't fans of it initially and then had to be convinced. So they've kind of started trying to set up a qualifying event of sorts, maybe not to the same level as Q School, and had sort of this entryway in. So they were trying to tick all the boxes, but only got points for these top 10 players. And even those points are still limited. I looked back at the first week that LIV got points. So that was at Riyadh in 2026, and Elvis Smiley won that week. He got 23 ranking points, which you might remember earlier. I was telling you a sort of PGA Tour event gets 50, a sort of average PGA Tour get 50. So that week he got 23 points, which was about the same as finishing third at the WM Phoenix Open. So gives you a sense of where that sort of prorated point system was going, and something that upset LIV players initially when they heard the news.
And understandably, and you get that. And I just want to point out quickly, Jamie, that you take yourself back to 1968. Mark McCormack is doing these independent rankings for the first time, just a humble man and his calculator. And go to 2024, when this debate is kind of reaching its peak. And just at Golf Digest, you've got our colleague Joel Beal saying, get rid of the world rankings. Sam Weinman writes a thing like, here's some new rankings, here's a new idea. And we were all writing about it. We were all talking about it. I even said in 2024, we love to quote Shane Ryan on this podcast. I said, in the next year, we're going to learn a lot about the OWGR, but most importantly, we're going to learn whether it has the flexibility and the good luck to survive. Wow. Again, very McCormack-like, presciently seeing what's going to come down the pipeway. And they were flexible enough to survive. We proved, again, they did something kind of placating. And now, Jamie, of course, we're looking at it in hindsight, but now we're sitting here where we may expect as early as tomorrow an announcement that LIV is folding, essentially. And you have to look at that as one of the blows, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's as big as Koepka and Patrick Reed leaving, but this world rankings thing that they've been chasing forever to get, it's like a dog chasing a bone and the bone ends up being made of asparagus or something. You're like,
it was a mirage the whole time.
It was a mirage the whole time. So you have to look at that as kind of a key point. And I just say all this because what an incredible amount of influence this system has, and what an incredible amount of discussion it takes, and even kind of steers the course of golf history a little bit, which is why we're talking about it, why it's one of the 50 most important things. So where do we go from here, Jamie?
Yeah, I think maybe we can wrap up and sort of do some of our awards and get into sort of legacy discussions here and how it changed. But I think you summed it up pretty well. But one thing I've written down here to summarize it. It was from a piece in Golf Digest from 2022, who's the final word of this piece went to David Fay, who is a longtime executive director at the USGA. We've quoted a lot of people here, but bear in mind, this is just 4 years ago, and I think he summed it up well when he said, if there were no OWGR, what would replace it? Having some kind of printed eligibility list, albeit subjective, is beneficial. Let's face it, we live in a world of subjective lists and ranking. College academics, college sports, college football playoffs, restaurants, doctors, lawyers, golf courses, cars, everything in this world is ranked subjectively. And to be fair, never shied away from the fact that it's not a perfect system, but they're willing, as you wrote in 2024, to be flexible, to change, to adapt. I think we all probably worried for it in the last 3 or 4 years of where it was going. But as you say, with this live news potentially coming now, if it had been given OWGR points initially, I don't think we'd be at this stage now. It would be a very different landscape of golf. It gives you that comparison. It gives you the chat. From a fan's perspective, it gives us that debate, and it's interesting to see, for us, Bob McIntyre becoming, a Scot that ranks inside the top 10. That hasn't happened in a while or something like that. But sort of professionally, it gives the majors this very legitimate and sort of scientific way to ensure that they have the best players playing in the best fields together.
Yeah, and I think it satisfies both of what McCormack claimed it was for originally, which is, as you said, a talking point, a way to compare people, a discussion point, and also an incredible lever of power, which, again, we keep saying Mark McCormack would have loved this. Mark McCormack would have loved it, that the PGA Tour and the majors used it as a lever of power to help destroy live golf. I'm not saying it was the only lever, but it was a key lever. So, I mean, should we do our awards? Should we get right to the fun stuff?
Let's do it, Shane.
All right.
The first award we tend to give out is called the what if moment. So a tipping point or what if moment. Shane, I'll let you go first.
Well, you just had a great one, which was, what if Liv had gotten OWGR from the very beginning? Let me go a little bit back in time. What if there had been no Mark McCormack? What if this exceptional great man of history had not existed? Would we have had to invent it anyway? And I think, to go to David Fay's quote, yes, we would have. I mean, there's obviously a need for this kind of thing, but how would it have been different if you didn't have this guy who is the overseer, the puppet master? And I would just like to, I have no answer, but I would love to be transported into that alternative universe and go, oh yeah, it's about, we take the birdies you make and divide it by the bogeys, or, whatever the case is. It'd be fun to see.
Taylor Gooch is world number one.
Taylor Gooch he's eclipsed Tiger Woods for the most weeks at number one.
He's in the GOAT
that's my what if. That's my what if. What's yours?
Yeah, mine. It probably does come back to the live debate back in the early 2021. The OWGR board sat on the proposal for a long time. They didn't respond initially, and I think if they'd given even the points that they have now back then, I think we'd be looking at a very different landscape of golf, and maybe one that was maybe slightly skewed towards the wrong direction in terms. I think all of us purists and traditionalists, and that includes me and you, would prefer events. We prefer to see the meritocracy in the game, and I think that might have been eroded slightly had OWGR points gone to live initially. So I'd probably go with that back in 2022 or 2021 when the debate was going on. Shane, I enjoy this one, as you know, the Kim Jong-un Award for the most unbelievable stat or fact. Where does your head go here?
Yeah, I think I have to go. Man, you gave a couple. I like that in this crazy system, a man poked his head above water for 7 days and then disappeared forever. It's like one of those prehistoric fish, that live on the bottom, coming up just on July 4th at midnight. It comes up to the surface, you see it, and then it descends to the depths again. So Tom Lehman for me.
Yeah, just a reminder that we celebrate Tom Lehman Week on April 20th every year. But it's hard to not look at 683 weeks at world number one for Tiger. I think he has two separate streaks that lasted longer than anybody in the game, and even Greg Norman, Rory McIlroy, Scotty, all these guys. But I think I'll go with the Phil stat, the fact that he spent 270 weeks at world number two and never made it to world number one. I actually challenged the OWGR crew last week, asking them. I believe there is a week, and I'll need to go back and find it. Maybe I'll follow up on the next podcast. I think there was a week, a US Open, where if Phil had won the event. I think he finished second. That if he'd won, he would have got to world number one. So it was as close as sort of one hole away from it, and never got it. And it's sort of defines his legacy of always being a little bit of number two at the US Open, a little bit of number two to Tiger in popularity as well as success. And so I think that fact speaks to it pretty well. Shane, best quote, headline, or tweet. There's a lot to choose from here. I really enjoy your description from 2015. I'm going to give you credit here. The one that we opened the second act with there. I just thought maybe it was a voice I was using, but I just like that idea of the complexity, and everything's built on an imperfect complexity, and I think that summed it up well. So credit to you.
I'll do it. And what my favorite quote and what I think Mark McCormack's voice would be. Okay. What if the Arabs played golf? That was my version of what a powerful businessman would sound like, and I think I just ended up sounding pathetic. But
it sounds like you spent a bit of time in Australia, maybe. But
yeah, what if the Arabs play golf, mate? Now I do think that is like just so funny, because it's like you can see right where his brain is going. Mm-hmm. Like if he was around 10 years later, he would have done live, or he would have done some kind of thing to get like the Saudi Arabians involved or something. He just could see it all. And it's remarkable to read that quote in 1974. Truly, 50 years before it happened.
Incredible. Yeah. We've discussed a lot of people, including McCormack, throughout this. Tony Greer and Bernard Langer was world number one. All these different people. Shane, if there was a movie, who do you think would be the best supporting actor in this story?
I'm picturing a sort of combo of C-3PO and R2-D2 in the form of Blinky, the tennis computer. Blinky the tennis computer. He's just there. He sort of comes around and does comic relief. He goes, "Hey, Mark, why don't you chill out?" Things maybe like that. Little ones.
Just in the background of every shot. Just every shot of the film is just subtly positioned in the background. Just spitting out numbers, but
Mark McCormack asked it for advice. That it's like maybe a little bit like Kit and Knight Rider.
There you go. I think I'm going to get in trouble from the Oscar crowd when I suggest this and push it at the sort of pre-run-up, but I'd like to see McCormack be it. I think lots of people don't know McCormack's story, so to me he is more of a support here than a lead, but I think he would have played a very interesting role in the film of all this. But the next two categories to go, Shane, we have piece of memorabilia and the unintended consequence. So I'll start, shall I, with piece of memorabilia. There's a couple. I thought maybe I would take that original facts of the first ever rankings. If you could get your sort of hands on the original of that, what was printed to then be sent out, that's kind of changed the course of history within the game. And I think I don't know where that's housed, but that would be an interesting thing to have. But I'll name drop here Tiger's name, Shane, so you can forgive me here and roll your eyes. But as I said on the last podcast, and I'll probably try and sandwich into every podcast that we do, that I spent a day with Tiger at his house in 2020 or 2019, sorry. And in the basement of his house, he has in the main floor of his house, he has his major trophies, all separated by shelf of the major. So it's just this wall of 15 trophies, which is obviously impressive. But in the basement, he keeps all of his trophies that he's won throughout the years. And at the end of every year, there's a Mark McCormack Award, which is given, which is the player who spent the most weeks in the calendar year at world number one. And Tiger won it 14 times, Shane. So you walk around walk around what is essentially a museum in the basement of his house, and you see there's 14 of these trophies. And I did think at the time, you've got so many multiples of so many different trophies, you wouldn't even miss it if I just walked out with it. And it's just it's a statue of the man himself that you can see here. So instead of having this ask you if I could have had it. So
if I know my Mark McCormack, his face is on that trophy, right?
Yeah, of course, with his name on Gary Player-esque larger font than everything else. But
I think I would get my hands on those Mark McCormack sleep data. I want all those papers.
Okay, the cards.
Logging all his hours. I want them from the time he was a kid. I want to study this man and maybe sort of run the numbers and get a sense of how to become successful. And I'll publish them. Yeah.
The origin story to Whoop, maybe there. Just
he was doing
his sleep. Yeah, he was again ahead of his time, Shane, as we've said many times. Ahead of his time. And then finally, just the unintended consequence of all this. One thing, this is maybe a little bit silly, but I talked to you about the fact that it's this talking point, and I do get the sense that it gives credit to the tiger side of the GOAT debate a little bit subtly, and the fact that McCormack had his rankings from 68 and Jack was number one at the end of the first 9 years that he did it. But so much of Tiger's legacy was built on the fact that when he came to world number one, he was the fastest to ever get to world number one. It took him 42 weeks from the time he turned pro to get to world number one, which is crazy to think that he didn't even play a year as a pro before he ascended to world number one. But just the fact that he had these spells and 683 weeks at world number one, I have no idea. Scheffler feels like he's insurmountable at the moment, but who knows where that goes. But I've always felt that Tiger's world ranking arguments sort of have always given him a little bit of an edge in some people's mind.
Yeah, that's a great one. I'll piggyback off that and just say, when I was writing that piece in 2015, we referenced the reason I was calling the OWGR such a great system is that it, at the time, accurately reflected how close the race was between Rory McIlroy and Jordan Spieth. And so it was like 1 week, one is number one. Then it could be on fractions, right? What tournament did you drop 2 years earlier? That gives Rory the edge. Now Jordan finishes 7th, but he loses a time when he finished 19th. So now he's number one. So it just accurately reflected that cool dynamic. And that's what a good ranking system can do. And it's one of the shames of LIV because it kind of destroys that a little bit. But maybe now we get back into the era where it can give us such a good reflection, statistical reflection of just how close, or in your case, in your example, how dominant a player can be.
Well, there's the awards, Shane. I don't think we missed anything. There won't be an elephant section in the next episode because we've nailed it.
No,
but
perfect.
I enjoyed the discussion. I do find it fascinating. I do find it interesting to see where it goes, even in the next 24 hours as we speak, Shane, to see where it goes. But do you have any final thoughts before we part ways?
No, just funny how one man's system can become all things, a lever of power, like we talked about, a weighted discussion, something very significant to players. Oh, we're trying to get in the top 50 after the Houston Open so we can play in the Masters this year. Just an engine of drama and competition. Really, I think just an extraordinary system, and it could only have come from an extraordinary human being, Mark McCormack. So I think it certainly belongs in our little 50 things pantheon here, Jamie.
Yeah, very well put. I do find that interesting that so much of modern society is built on the back of tweaking and subtle impacts that different people have or different organizations have, but this feels very much rooted in one man and one man's belief and his vision. And you talked about him seeing around corners, and we've highlighted that 4 or 5 times throughout this. And the fact that we're discussing this on a podcast in 2026 when he started that speech back in 1974 is wild. So I encourage anyone to go back and read that. And for anyone that listened to this, we say thank you. Please subscribe to the podcast. Please watch on YouTube. Shane, thank you very much for your help. That's been the 50 Things That Changed Golf podcast from Golf Digest. Join us next time for another deep dive into the events that shaped the game.